You know, I was gonna go on a rant about how long this took to ship out, but I needed to remember this is my first time ordering something all the way up from China. If you recall my video about the RG35XX, you'll know that I originally wanted to try out the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, but they weren't making it anymore, and the only way I could buy one is if I bought a used one off of eBay. Until very recently. This is the Retroid Pocket 2S, and it quickly became my favorite portable emulator. As someone who is still a bit of a novice when it comes to setting up portable emulators, I gotta say, this was actually pretty easy to set up while also being kind of confusing. It was actually pretty similar when I set up my Android phone as a portable emulator. When opening it up, it comes with, of course, the console, a sheet with all the specs, I think, a USB-C cable for charging and transferring ROMs from your computer, and plastic. Everything you need for a video game console. It starts you off with a regular Android setup, having you set up Wi-Fi, time zones, and also a select number of pre-installed apps. I downloaded the emulators I knew about, like Dolphin, Mupin, RetroArch, and so on. Plus, you can enable the Google Play Store so that you can download other emulators, front ends, and etc. And after that, it asks you if you want to start off with the regular vanilla Android launcher or the Retroid launcher. I chose Android because I knew one setting I needed to change before anything. When you go into settings, go to where it says handheld settings, then go into input, and then go into where it says controller style. You'll have two options, retro or Xbox. It'll have retro as the default. You need to go ahead and switch to Xbox because that's the controller style that all these portable emulators seem to use, and it'll just make your life a lot easier, and the worst you'll have to do is just reconfigure a few controls for for one or two emulators, which is very easy. It's then after that you can open up the Retroid launcher, which just appears as a normal app on the home screen. Now, I know I said this was easy to set up, but that's mainly because it only took me like 45-ish minutes, something like that. That doesn't mean it wasn't confusing at all. When opening up the Retroid launcher, it's just kind of a blank slate and it doesn't really tell you what to do. Luckily for me, I saw a bunch of tutorials before this about how to set up these Retroid consoles, and basically just applied what I remembered from those tutorials onto how to set this up, really. And yeah, pretty much everything on this I think I have pretty figured out so far. As I said, it's a blank slate until you hit where it says Emulation. It'll then ask you what systems you want on here, and you can add more if you want. You then have to hit where it says Setup, Create ROMs folder, and then either pick SD card or internal storage. It's kind of just whichever you prefer, really. That's kind of when I knew as soon as I did that, I was ready to start putting ROMs on it. I chose to do the internal storage because I thought that would be a lot easier, and it really was. All you have to do is plug the USB-C cable that it came with into your computer, and it shows up as a hard drive. That's when you can start dragging and dropping the ROMs into it. Now, if you do decide to do it on a micro SD card, you will need a micro SD card reader. I'll have a link in the description for one you can buy for pretty cheap off of Amazon. Now, where you get the ROMs is something I can't really tell you how to do because it's not legal, but I assure you it's very easy to do. Once you have all your ROMs on here, the next thing you have to do is go into the Retroid launcher, select the system, hit ROMs, add, then either pick your internal storage or micro SD card as the ROMs directory, and then hit scan so that it can start recognizing all of your ROMs. You'll start to see them show up with some of the original box art already scraped. Note that you may have to close the Retroid launcher, go back and scan again, because sometimes it just wouldn't recognize some of my ROMs, but after closing it, going back into the Retroid launcher, scanning again, it started to recognize them just fine. When you try to open up a game for the first time, it may not open right away. This is mainly a thing that'll happen with any game that runs off of RetroArch as the recommended emulator. The way that I knew what I had to do was I had to go into RetroArch and download certain cores, and the only way I could actually know what core I needed was by going to where it says edit, and then it shows me the recommended emulator as well as the recommended core. I just use the recommended core for each system that uses RetroArch, and they all ran perfectly fine. Systems like N64 that use Mupin or Dreamcast that use Redream, you don't need to download cores or anything. It just boots up instantly. And whenever you're done with a game, you can just hit the home button on the console and it'll go right back to the Retroid launcher. I really like this launcher. It may have been a little weird to set up, but I like it. Systems show up like how games show up on a Switch's home screen. But enough talking about the setup process. We can finally get to talking about the emulation quality. And I'm happy to report that emulation quality is awesome. Now, there are two versions of the Retroid Pocket 2S. There's the $99 version that comes with 3 gigs of RAM and 32 gigabytes of storage, which I'm more than confident you can get by with just fine. Now, there is also the $119 version that is 4 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage, which is the one I have right now. The extra gig of RAM is just to make things a little snappier and maybe a little smoother, but it's not really a necessity, and neither is the extra storage, because you can just buy a new SD card for the console and use that as the storage. The only reason I got the one with the extra RAM and extra storage is just because of my own personal preference. Now, for everything all the way up to PlayStation 1, runs amazing on this thing. I haven't noticed any frame skips or any lag between any of the systems I was trying up to PS1. I will say though, PlayStation 1 was giving me a hard time at first, because the default emulator I had it for was DuckStation, which would not boot my games at all, saying it didn't detect any BIOS files, which I thought was fine. I knew I didn't have any BIOS files for PS1, so this makes sense. But even after getting the BIOS files, it still said it didn't recognize them, so I didn't know what to do. I tried downloading another emulator called Retroid, and it ran just fine on that, so I thought maybe I could switch the default emulator on the Retroid launcher from DuckStation to Retroid. But no, it doesn't have the option to. But I did see an option for RetroArch, so I tried that, and after downloading the core I needed and booting it up, it ran perfectly fine, even after saying it still didn't detect any BIOS files. So I don't know what that's about, but it's working fine now, and I'm fine with it as it is. I'm happy to say that the same can be said for N64 and Dreamcast. This is some of the best N64 and Dreamcast emulation I've seen in a portable form factor. I can even fast forward through unskippable cutscenes in both systems. Even some of the harder games to emulate for both systems run great. Games for N64 that require use of the expansion pack still run amazing. Donkey Kong 64 ran smooth as butter, and Perfect Dark ran great, but it did have some noticeable stutters every now and then, but I'll forgive it for that because that game didn't run well at all on the original N64. For Dreamcast, Sonic Adventure 2 ran flawlessly, no glitchy textures or any frame dips at all, unlike how it was on my Android phone back then. And I do know that PSP is usually here with N64 and Dreamcast, but I'm going to be honest here, guys. I already know it can run great on this thing, but I didn't bother put any of the PSP ROMs I had on this thing because this is a small screen. This is a 3.5-inch IPS display. And in case you don't remember or just don't know, PSP aspect ratio is 16:9. So if I were to put this on this small screen, it's going to be extremely cropped or stretched. And I just don't think that's going to be very fun to play on. So yeah. Obviously you can if you want, but I just wouldn't do it personally. That's just my own preference. DS emulation also runs awesome. I don't recommend all DS games on this. Games like Mario Kart DS that don't require you to look at both screens will feel a lot better to play, but games like Sonic Rush that have Sonic going between both screens all the time are not, because you'll have to look at both screens on this one small enough screen. You'll have to experiment a bit with DS. It runs just fine, but you might be surprised what games might be a pain in the butt to play on here. Most people recommend using a dedicated DS emulator anyway. Now, here comes the big boy, GameCube. Now, I know people test PS2 games along with GameCube games on this, but there aren't really any PS2 games that I want to play, and from what I've seen of other people's reviews on PS2 emulation on this, it doesn't run well at all on this. So yeah, don't get this if you're looking to play PS2. Now, if you're looking to play some GameCube games, I am happy to say, while this definitely is not made for GameCube games either, it does run some GameCube games pretty damn well. Games like Smash Bros. Melee ran surprisingly really well. It just depends on which stage you play, because some can make the frame rate dip, but if you want to jump in a quick match with the CPU and just make sure to pick a less graphically intensive stage, you're not going to have a lot of problems. Simpsons Hit and Run also ran pretty good for this device. Some noticeable frame dips, but for the most part this game runs at a playable speed. But there are some duds. Super Mario Sunshine wouldn't go above 25 frames at all, and I know you can also swipe down and change the performance settings to extreme to get some better performance, but it didn't really help. It still ran pretty bad in my opinion. Same goes for Spider-Man, extremely poor performance. Double Dash runs for the most part, but when I tried using the Vulkan backend like I did for every other GameCube game I played, the game was dim. I couldn't see anything. After switching to the OpenGL backend, that fixed it and it still ran fine for the most part, but that is a little annoying if I ever do want to play and I have to constantly go into the Dolphin emulator and change the settings in that emulator, and then go back to the Retroid launcher and launch the game from there. But otherwise, I'm still impressed with what I was able to get out of GameCube with this thing. Is it perfect GameCube emulation? Absolutely not. But you can experiment with what you can get running on here, and you may even be surprised with what you can get running. So yeah, in case I haven't made it obvious at this point, this is my favorite portable emulator. It emulates so many things that I want to play to the point where all the cons that I really have to say about this thing get vastly outweighed by all the pros. Because remember, people, this is only $100. And back then, when the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus came out, and that was $100, that could only emulate all the way up to N64 and Dreamcast just okay from what I heard from other reviews. But this is now the type of performance we're getting these days for just $100. This is almost perfect for those who want to get into emulation on a budget. The only kind of people that this makes it hard to recommend are the type of people who just want the device to work right out of the box. It's really not that simple. You kind of have to tinker with it a bit just to get it set up, and still have to tinker even more to get some of your games running. And while it's not hard to get games running on here, I can still see someone super new to emulation getting super confused about some of the stuff I talked about in this video, and I don't blame them. I would definitely recommend watching some tutorials on this. I'm mainly just trying to tell you guys my experience with playing around with this with a few tips, of course. But yeah, that's my take on the Retroid Pocket 2S. Again, it may be a little confusing to set up, but if you just do your homework a little bit on emulation and just some of the emulators, you'll have a much easier time when setting this thing up. But this is definitely the best portable emulator right now for the price. If not the best, then at least one of the best for sure. But what do you guys think about the Retroid Pocket 2S? Does this look cool to you? Is this going to get you into emulation finally? What do y'all think? Let me know in the comment section down below. And just let me know how I'm doing with these review videos. Again, this is a new style of video making for me. I'm still trying to just get my feet wet into it. I tried using a script this time. Last time I talked about the RG35XX, I didn't have a script. I did all improv. And I'm still kind of happy with how that video turned out, but not the most happy. But yeah, this time I used a script. And just let me know how I'm doing this. I'm sure I didn't do a perfect job trying to review this. I'm doing my best. I'm doing what I can. But yeah, I'll see y'all next time.